Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers for the opportunity to be here, to listen and learn from all your experiences, and to share some of our experiences in the Worldwide Anti-Malarial Resistance Network, or what we call fondly WARN, about trying to level the playing field, particularly for data contributors from malaria endemic countries. We haven't quite sorted out how to meet Akin's ambitious goal yesterday of making teams swap sides halfway through the game. Maybe we're a long way off halfway through the game. But what I hope to be able to explain to you is how we see that advancing more equitable data sharing is also a way of making data sharing more efficient, more scientifically expedient, hopefully resulting in better science and better health. Is that better? The Worldwide Anti-Malarial Resistance Network, for those of you who don't know, aims to provide information necessary to prevent or alleviate anti-malarial drug resistance. And if we have more effective treatments, hopefully we'll have fewer malaria cases, fewer malaria deaths. It was conceived as a global collaborative network, and it was really and is really trying to make evidence fit for purpose. We try and build the puzzle by putting together data that's clinical, data on drug concentrations, data of molecular markers of resistance, in vitro resistance, drug quality, into understanding why treatments are working or not working. And that kind of data has the potential to hopefully reduce the malaria burden. We conceived of WARN way back in 2004. It took to 2007 before we had a planning grant, and 2009 until we were funded. And what's really important for me about this timeline is that WARN was conceived and given birth long before there were any of these mandates by funders, by publishers, by regulatory authorities that people had to share data. So it was designed with a kind of carrot approach in mind. We had to attract people to want to share data with us. There was no one pushing them. There was no stick. Anti-malarial drug resistance is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, threat to the control and eventual elimination of malaria. Many of you will know that Southeast Asia is really grappling with horrible levels of drug resistance to all available anti-malarials. The picture on your left is the cover in Nature. On the right, a BBC News article. So people are realizing how close this is to a global threat, although the WHO has not yet classified artemisinin resistance as a global health threat. To us, there are a lot of similarities about the urgency and the importance of sharing data that make some of our situations quite similar to things like the Ebola outbreak. Probably because we've been in this game now for about 15 years, we've had to really try and work hard about how best we can contribute to encourage and enable data sharing. And I think that we've learned that there are a lot of bad ways of getting people to share data. If you only have the stick, people can tick that box. Yes, we've shared our data, we've put it here. We haven't actually given anything useful. We haven't given the metadata that will help people understand it. Sometimes they don't give data dictionaries, and that's just ticking the box, but not contributing to the whole rationale behind data sharing. So over the years, many years, we were young and lovely when this all started. We've worked with all of our collaborators from 280 institutions globally, most of them in malaria endemic countries, to try and develop our frameworks, scientific frameworks, technical frameworks, ethical frameworks, governance frameworks, to be something that achieves ethical, equitable, and impactful data sharing. And I think that our perceptions of what is equitable and how this can be achieved has been shaped very much by those many years of interaction. Despite that context of anti-malarial drug resistance being recognized, at least in the malaria community, as a huge threat, and all of those frameworks that should enable and encourage data sharing, it's not an easy thing for people to do, and I quite understand that. So what are the obstacles for people? Why do people worry about sharing data? The feedback that we get, firstly, is that all of us are worried about, is our data really up to international scrutiny? Will someone else who analyzes our data come up with the same results? The second problem that we face, which is highlighted in the image on the right, is that a lot of people no longer can find their data. They're not sure which the final data set was. The computer that the data was on has crashed. The student that did the analysis has left. And so the longer you are away from the collection of the data, the harder it is for people to retrieve their data. And then lastly, which is I think the focus for this session, there are a lot of people, particularly from malaria endemic countries, who feel like they are not in as good a position to benefit from the fruits of data sharing. So they'll do all the hard work and collect the data, but once it's shared, they're not as likely to benefit from the secondary use of the data. And so our approach has realized that if we don't address these concerns, and there are more, but I haven't got time to go into them, then the quantity of data shared will be compromised. The quality of data shared will be compromised. And worst of all, we could make worse the already vast gaps between high income and lower income countries' researchers. We don't want to be exacerbating that gap. We've developed a whole range of approaches, and I'm just going to give you 3 examples. The one is our development of tools and resources that should make it easier, quicker, and better for people to be able to collect and share quality data. I must highlight that it's very interesting to watch data that gets shared. And some of the worst quality data comes from the richest countries in the world, and some of the best quality data comes from the poorest countries in the world. So don't assume that the issue with data quality is related to poverty at all. Both sides of the fence, the rich and the poor, benefit from having a toolkit, which we've got over 100 tools, where we try and help researchers frame questions, develop a good plan, execute their study with everything from data collection forms, standard operating procedures, help them analyze data. We do quite a lot of that semi-automatically. We give data contributors a report on the data that they've given, and we'll say that you've got a 5-year-old person that weighs 102 kilograms. Could it perhaps be 10.2 kilograms? So, it's an iterative and hopefully helpful process. We've done a lot of partnerships. We partnered with the World Health Organization when we developed, I think, much needed guidance on how to measure drug concentrations for anti-malarials. More recently, we partnered with CDISC to develop data standards for the malaria therapeutic area. And these have recently been published and are available online, free online, which was another big achievement. Until this month, CDISC had a policy that data had to be shared through their platform. You had to pay $150 to access any of their materials, their training materials. And we argued that in terms of global health and in terms of the contributions made by WARN, by IDO, by others, these need to be freely accessible, freely available online. And 2 weeks ago, they confirmed that not just the malaria tools, but all global health tools and donor-funded projects will now be available freely online. We've also developed a proficiency testing program that's based in Bangkok, where laboratories can be sent samples with a fixed concentration, and they give their results back, and they get feedback to see how far they are off what was expected, how far they are off what other laboratories saw, and they can get to understand the quality of the assays that they are providing. Since its inception, we've grown from 10 to 66 laboratories globally participating in that network. We also provide free reference materials because it achieves economies of scale. So it's a way of enhancing the data quality. In terms of addressing the question of people losing their data, one of the nice things is that we provide a secure long-term repository to store your data. And many of us have gone back to WARN saying, my computer crashed, I've lost my data, can you please share with me the data that I gave you? And it all comes back to you. And it's been standardized according to the CDISC standards. We can give back the original version, we can give back the standardized version. So these are all things that I think enhance data quality, but also enhance the efficiency of data collection. When I did my first clinical trial, I would have loved 20 years ago if all these tools had been available and I can look at them, change what I don't like, use what I do like. And I think in this way it advances the scientific expediency, as well as hopefully narrowing that gap between the resource-rich and the resource-poor settings. Another example of a way of promoting equity is that we created 5-6 years ago now the concept of study groups. So we built this whole platform, and then data sharing wasn't that enthusiastic. And if we got data, it was quite old data. So what we did is we said, well, how do we persuade people that there are questions that can't be answered in studies, even if you can do quite a big, well-funded studies? One study on their own can't answer these questions. So we defined things that could be enhanced by collating and using all available data. And mostly these are done through individual participant data or patient data, meta-analyses. You all know the advantages: greater statistical power, increased validity. We get to understand whether findings are generalizable or not. We have an adequate sample size, or quite often to understand vulnerable populations that are systematically excluded from a lot of clinical trials. But for each trial, a few very young children, a few malnourished children creep through, and then we can put these data together to understand, are those people more likely to fail treatment? Are they likely to have lower drug concentrations? Could they benefit from having dose recommendations changed? And so in this way, these study groups can work towards ensuring the greater efficacy of existing drugs, and increasingly we ask to look at the newer drugs being developed as well. I think what's important about the study group approach is, firstly, it acts as a magnet. It helps people understand the real value of sharing data. I think for a lot of researchers, this demand that they share data is theoretical and bureaucratic, and they can't quite see the point, and they haven't been involved in anything where there's been much benefit. So participation in a study group helps them see what additional questions can be answered. Questions can be posed by anyone, and quite often it's people sitting in malaria endemic countries that are most aware of what the unresolved questions are. What high proportion of their patients come from groups that are systematically excluded from clinical trials? And in that way, there's equitable access. Anyone can pose a question. Anyone who contributes data can be part of these study groups. As important as the sharing of data, I think, is the sharing of the expertise in this group, because you bring together everyone who's collected data on a subject. They've all had sleepless nights about it. They all care about it. And so you build that pool of expertise WARN will assist with technical or statistical support because the processes for doing meta-analyses and PRISMA guidelines and ticking all the boxes is becoming more and more demanding. And so with that pooled scientific expertise, everyone has something to contribute, but everybody learns something as well. And we hope in this way, it's one way of facilitating more equitable benefit from shared data. The last example is what we try and do in terms of skills sharing, capacity development, capacity building. And a few examples of that are training workshops. It's really interesting that we have specialist training in many things, probably too many things, but data management is not an academically recognized field by itself and often not adequately supported. Career paths are not where they should be. And actually, one of my big, what are those moments called? Aha moments, was realizing that if I don't get my data management right, which I'll never manage on my own, but get in a really good data manager, my research career should be stopped there and then. So these are a group of people that we wanted to nurture and support and encourage and enable. And one of the nicest training workshops I've ever been part of, we had in January this year in Nairobi, where we had 44 researchers, data managers from 29 different countries across the world. And that's the picture you can see on your list. We've had similar workshops. We had one here at SPEAR many years ago about measuring drug concentrations and analyzing them. We had one in Senegal in April. We had one in Zambia last year when we asked people to explain to us what was difficult about data sharing, what they would like, and got really useful feedback. We're also hosting as many EDCTP, TDR career development fellows as we can, because if we could bring these young rising stars into an understanding of how to make the best use of available data to impact on policy and practice, we hope that that will grow the pool of people wanting to do these analyses in endemic countries in the future. And lastly, we are trying to assist in other diseases. So WARN has been the prototype, and it now is part of an umbrella organization called the Infectious Diseases Data Observatory, where we work with researchers in other neglected poverty-related infectious diseases to try and replicate this model, which includes things like visceral leishmaniasis, schistosomiasis, soil-transmitted helminths, Ebola. So what I've described to you is probably a very good example of one of the most ambitious, complex, and challenging ways of trying to build a data platform. There are many simpler ways to go, but I'm not sure that the simpler, shorter-term approaches would have the same impact on the output. So after these 15 years, we're starting to reap some rewards. As I've mentioned, we have a network which includes over 280 collaborators. We think we have about 80% of the world's data on the most widely recommended treatment for malaria. We have an interdisciplinary approach. We try and enhance quality. We support people with toolkits. So we have a much broader approach than a lot of data sharing platforms, but we think that that breadth is necessary. We are not just a data sharing platform, although I think that was how we were originally conceived in people's minds to be. So you will have heard from the toolkit examples of the kinds of things we try and do earlier in the process to enhance the quality and quantity of data collection. With the study groups and meta-analyses, we give input to synthesizing data. And then we work quite hard to also disseminate this evidence to policymakers. And we were really pleased to see in the last edition of the World Health Guidelines for the treatment of malaria that at least 3 of the recommendations came directly out of WARN studies, changing doses for young children for one of the antimalarials, showing greater efficacy with a fixed dose combination rather than loose tablets with one of the others. So it really does become impactful. But that impact and ethical, equitable work, I think, only happens because of the broader participation in this evidence ecosystem. A data platform on its own could end up just being a dump site. So we have challenges. I have such a long list of headaches and speed bumps and challenges that I could share with you, but I think two that would be most relevant to our discussions is that despite all of these efforts, data sharing still remains pretty slow. People take quite a long time to publish their data, and then they take quite a long time to clean it up. And there's about a 6-month period quite often between people saying, yes, we'll happily share our data with you, and them actually completing the terms of submission and uploading their data. One of the problems is that most people don't see WARN as much for its broader work. They see it as a data sharing platform, so they think about us at the end of their study. They don't think about us as a source of support when they're designing their study or conducting their study, which is why we're having the workshops and we're trying to find ways to disseminate that awareness. A lot of that's been an unfunded mandate. You know, our goal is we've got to impact on drug resistance, but a lot of funders are not so keen on the capacity building side, etc. The other thing that's troubling, and I think needs to be addressed in a far broader forum like this, is that despite all the good logic about why data sharing is a good idea, there are actually very few requests for people to access data from our repository, and I understand more broadly, shared data isn't accessed that widely. Most of the requests from WARN come from high-income countries, mostly mathematical modelers, who don't see their role as collecting data, but they want to use available data. So we need to understand what the challenges are and how to really encourage people to share data promptly and to use the data that's shared. So the organizers have asked that we only pick 2 recommendations at the end of all of this work, which is a little bit tricky. So I thought I would pick on one that focuses primarily on the funders, and the second that focuses mostly on the researchers' world. I think what I would like for funders to perceive is that simultaneously achieving scientific expediency and equitable data sharing requires an investment in those resources. Capacity building, promoting fairness don't seem to be big turn-ons for most of the funders that we interact with. And yet the outputs that the funders want to achieve through data sharing, I think, depend very much on funding all those peripheral activities. And secondly, what you can achieve through data sharing is not a quick win. It's a long, hard road. And so I think that the framework of funding can't be with the short-term 3-year milestone-driven kind of funding. It's much more of an infrastructure kind of funding. Everyone wants to fund the add-ons that they can say what they got out of it, and someone has to fund the underpinning infrastructure. The second recommendation regards the research landscape. And I think that the research landscape hasn't really caught up with the mandate for data sharing, the potential of data sharing. So the incentive and rewards for data sharing for all contributors to secondary analyses are not really persuasive at the moment. If they were persuasive, we would have many more people quickly sharing their data and queues of people wanting to access the data. The nice thing about sharing a data rather than a biobank is that it's not mutually exclusive. It's not a limited amount. It's like a photograph. You can just keep sending it off. So we want lots of people to use it. I think part of the problem is that academic promotion hasn't yet caught up with data sharing mandates. So we get rewarded for original research. We doing secondary analyses, meta-analyses, which as a policymaker are the pinnacle of evidence. That's why WHO or a national treatment guideline will change its policy, are those meta-analyses. But in the academic world, don't waste your time on that stuff. It takes a lot of time and effort. Rather do the original research that you get promoted for. And there's absolutely no part of most promotion criteria that I'm aware of that give any recognition for sharing data. So I think that landscape needs to change. And the one currency that everyone understands is around authorship. And I think our study group model is a really good model for equitable data sharing. But the authorship remains, for secondary use, remains a huge headache. When we started, we didn't have the incentives and the mandates for data sharing. So we wanted to encourage people. We had a very inclusive approach to authorship. Basically, the author was the name of the study group, and all contributed were just listed alphabetically. And you and I know that there's some people that contributed 300 times more than other people, but there's no way of teasing that out. We're now moving towards a model where you can have a writing group. PubMed luckily allows for collaborators to be listed, and that's allowed some differentiation. But within those collaborators, it's not very equitable in terms of them all getting similarly listed. And what do we do about the people who contributed to the original study, but they're not the corresponding author? They didn't participate in the study group. How do we adequately reward them for the fact that without them, we wouldn't have had the data in the first place? So I'm hoping that the academic landscape and the authorship landscape will change from the drought-ridden part that Western Cape was until recently into the lush, lovely vineyards that we're now surrounded by. So I'd like to end by thanking the organizers, our funders, our data contributors, and our study participants, and feel free to follow up with us. Thank you.
So Karen, I wonder whether you have done any kind of analysis to see how many research papers actually came out of the WARN initiative, and then do you have a sense of how many of those papers have first or lead or senior authors from low and middle income countries?
So the Wellcome Trust asked Elizabeth Pisani to do an independent review of WARN, and that was one of the metrics that she used. And she concluded out of the 77 publications, the majority had last authors that came from higher income settings, but first authors from malaria endemic settings. There was some debate about how you measure it in something as complex as a collaboration like WARN, where all of us have many hats. So this morning I'm responsible for WARN pharmacology. This afternoon I'm doing my own research. Tomorrow morning I'm a policymaker. And so I think that she pulled together a lot of the things attached to our names rather than explicitly the WARN work. If you narrowed it down to the study groups that have been published, because they're published under a group name, you then don't end up with being able to say whether they're high or low income country people leading those analyses. But what you can see is about 2/3 of the co-authors came from malaria endemic settings.
Hi, Karen. My name is Naomi from Mahidol Oxford Research Unit, and thanks for a very clear talk. I'm just intrigued that despite the fact that a lot of the data in the WARN repository comes from low and middle income countries, there are less requests for access to this data from these countries. What do you think drives that?
It's a very good question, and I think that it's like all of the work that we do, that what's within Warren's control, we do the workshops, we provide the technical support, we have the fellows that I spoke about. But I think a much bigger obstacle are the context in which most of us work, and that we have too much other work, too little reward for doing those analyses. So I think it's probably more the research landscape incentivizing people to see the benefits of using that data. But I think we need to find more innovative ways, maybe sort of getting people to get free airtime or something if they come up with a really useful study group question. So some other ways of encouraging participation. I think a lot of the promotion, dissemination kind of work, which is our unfunded mandate, we need to expand to encourage people more. We find those people that do initiate study groups are mostly those that have been part of one study group because they were a data contributor, then they realize the benefit. So I'm hoping it will grow organically over time, but organically isn't really quick enough for people like me. So we need to find other ways, and any suggestions would be welcomed. Thanks, Naomi.
There's a question here and then a question there. So let's go to Florencia first and then Pekyung.
Okay, I'm Florencia Luna from Argentina. My voice is I am having problems, but my question in a way continues the one that was asked, because what I noticed also from your presentation, but also from some of the readings, like I think Fei Yong pointed in their experience to, is this lack of use of researchers from low middle income countries of the data and the possibility of redoing some kind of research. And I think this is really very problematic, because if you're thinking in this trying to leveling the situation, it's like, well, we are getting all the data and then the research is done abroad, even if with, let's say, good intentions in some cases. But I think that a way of getting true collaboration is to really begin deeply doing capacity building in these countries in a way that we enable this. And I was thinking regarding this, because I was asked to be part of the advisory committee of Cabana, which is like a bioinformatics capacity building effort in Latin America. So they are working there in Argentina, in Peru, in Mexico. It's several, it is a UK-based organization. I don't know really who is funding this, but the idea of my participation was, I think, mainly trying to not get in trouble, because, for example, they're working with biodiversity and infectious diseases, but I think that we should go deeper. It's not just having a person of ethics just to not get in trouble, or because also Latin America is very political, so you have to be really careful of what you're doing, but really trying to find different ways of getting engaged people and local people in order to find this work meaningful. Because if not, we continue to see that we are working for high-income countries to do the to have like the rewards, and not for low-income countries. So I think that one, as you were thinking in what funders should do, I think that it's very important to build capacity, and build capacity not only in the technique, but also in this idea of sharing and some ethical work with researchers. So we need to build them in both ways, not only the technical, but also I think in the ethics and the sharing and how we can do to attain these goals.
Right. So, and I think you gave us some wonderful examples of how we can achieve that. That's
So
like a
I may
comment, then a
then
question.
go to you for advice later.
But no, I totally agree with you, and I think it's one of the areas where we've been somewhat frustrated because we've seen the need, we have some capacity to help address it, but one of our main funders said, do not mention capacity building in your proposal. So there are some economies of scale that sort of generic clinical trial capacity building is funded separately. But we were told, you shouldn't include it. So then we do it all as an unfunded mandate, or you get a little pocket of money here and a little pocket money there. And I don't really understand how funders will be wanting equitable data sharing, but not be willing to do the deep capacity building needed, as you say. So I hope you can be on the advisory committee to those funders that need your guidance.
Baek-Yoon?
Thank you, Karen. That was fantastic. Firstly, I want to say that so in our data access committee, we receive lots of requests from secondary users. All of them, nearly 30 requests, all of them have come from high income settings. Sorry, not high income institutions, so similar scenario. And lots of modelers from Imperial College, LSD, MH, so I was looking at your recommendations. So I think incentivizing data sharing externally, in terms of academic recognition, I think that's important. I also think that there should be some internal, well, rather than looking at external incentives only, we should look internally. So the aims of, say, an institutional data sharing policy should be aligned with the aims of the institution. So if an institution is its aims is to help improving treatment of malaria, then the data sharing plans for the data for the primary and secondary analysis, whether it's done in-house or shared with other groups, if it works towards that direction, then that's impact already. Doesn't in addition to the usual parameters. So let's say an institution is to build capacity, then if the data is used for a master's thesis, whether or not it results in a publication should be counted as an indicator of successful data sharing. I think that would help us make decisions in prioritizing who to share data with, and also help with the success indicators of a institution. What do you think?
Quite agree. And one of the usual responses we have is if people want to access the data, we encourage them to engage with the data contributors who can often make the analysis much stronger. With some of the modelers, they're working in such a mathematical, almost theoretical framework that it's less easy for people like me, very clinical, practical, not numbers, trying to participate and contribute. So there's an additional layer of modeling involvement that makes it particularly hard. But I totally agree. I think each step of the way, we were talking earlier about when you submit a proposal, you need to say what you're going to do in terms of data sharing. And then people who decide about data access need to put in all these layers that can promote equity more.